Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hi, my name's Ilea Faircloth.
And I'm Dawn Capes.
And we're here to talk to you about the PLUS2 Lookfor calibration training. I will be facilitating the elementary +2s this year.
And I'll be facilitating the secondary +2 trainings this year.
The purpose of this training today is to really identify roles and responsibilities during the learning walk phase of +2, as well as understand how to collect evidence. So let's get started.
Let's do it.
Principals and school admin now have access to their school's +2 Google Drive folder to house completed agendas, principal PowerPoints, and learning walk forms. This feature is just for administrators. Please note, +2 will begin promptly at 8 a.m. at each school. The forms used for the +2 meetings will be emailed to principals, as well as they're able to be found on the Bay District School Improvement website. Principals will be emailed by the automated system 48 hours prior to the +2 at their school with the list of teachers who will be selected through the learning walk process. Teachers will be sent an email notifying them of being a learning walk participant, as well as what to expect and have out for evidence. Principals will have more teachers on the list than will input on the agenda, and that is okay. We know that teachers experience absences and life, so there should be flexibility in scheduling. Principals, feel free to swap learning walks and principal PowerPoints. This is up to you. Adjust your agenda accordingly. Our 6 Lookfors remain the same. We had Lookfor training during pre-service planning for the 2015-16 school year. Those videos are also found on the Bay District School Improvement webpage for future use during PLCs. During the learning walk phase of +2, we will be utilizing the scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not implemented, 5 being fully implemented and embedded. Roles and responsibilities during +2 vary depending on the cycle for which we are in. +2 happens in 2 cycles of data-driven dialogue, the principal PowerPoint, as well as the learning walk phase of +2. During the principal PowerPoint, table coaches will facilitate and lead conversations. Table coaches are instructional specialists and directors from the district office. During the learning walk phase, each person participating in a learning walk team will have identified roles. One person will be responsible for reviewing lesson plans, while another person will be in charge of keeping time. In addition, without having one of those roles, everyone is responsible for observing both teachers and students to collect evidence of the Lookfor. We will be using the Learning Walk system form, and it looks like this. You'll notice that the Lookfors are listed on the left-hand side with an additional Lookfor for schools who wish to collect data for their school improvement plan. You'll also notice that we have 4 classrooms because each team will be walking 4 classrooms for each team at the school. There will be a point at the bottom after all classrooms are walked through that we have opportunity for trends and patterns in terms of conversation. You'll notice on the right-hand side where we actually put in our ratings, there is 2 rows for each classroom. The top row is for individuals to list their numbers prior to walking outside and away from classrooms to have that collaboration conversation and calibrate our scores. Those scores for the group, the consensus, will be listed on the bottom row. Dawn?
All right, so now what we want to talk about is when we give our rating on the form that Ilea just shared, we want to be able to have a rating that's based on evidence. And how do we gather evidence? Well, what we want to do is we want to record what was seen and heard when we were in the classroom. And we really want to look to 2 individuals and groups in the room, which would be the teacher and the students. Historically, we usually look at the teacher and see what's going on with him or her in order to gather our evidence. But for the Lookfors, many of them, The 5 is predicated based on whether or not the students are involved and what's their level of involvement. So we want to gather evidence about what is the teacher saying and doing, what are the students saying and doing. And we might look for our evidence in lesson plans, because that is what we would see what the teacher either is going to do or has done. And we can also look for the students on what's on their desk, what are they working on, and we might also interview the students to find out what is going on to gather our evidence.
Dawn, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm a teacher and I know that my colleague does this Lookfor, and or I could be a coach and I've been in so many of our classrooms, or I could be an administrator and I've seen it in action numerous times. So I know that on the Lookfor calibration language that a particular Lookfor should be rated a 5.
And we want to be careful with that, Ilea, because when we gather our evidence, we want to remove our bias and opinion, because opinions can go either way. We could have a really strong and favorable opinion about something we know that goes on in the classroom, or it could go the other direction. So we want to make sure that we talk about the evidence, because when we go out into the out of the classroom and into the hallway and we talk about that evidence, it's then about the evidence and it's not about the person, because we want to rate the Lookfor, we don't want to rate the person. And to remove that bias and to remove that defensiveness that people might get, and really that feeling of protection, I want to protect this person, it's not about the teacher. That's the evaluation. And that's a totally different thing. Here we're trying to get to what does the evidence say in order to rate the Lookfor, not the teacher. So if we take a look at a couple of examples, we have the first one. The classroom was welcoming. If somebody wrote that down on their piece of evidence, would that be an opinion or evidence?
Well, Dawn, I think that that's an opinion.
And you know what, Ilea, that is an opinion, because the classroom was welcoming is my opinion. So what I could say instead would be evidence, would be the teacher greeted each child as each walked into the room. That would be evidence that the classroom was welcoming, but now I have specific evidence of what happened. Another one, Ilea, might be the teacher asked higher order thinking questions. So what do you think, Ilea, opinion or evidence?
Well done. I'm really going back and forth on this one, because higher order thinking questions, I think that could be evidence. But I'm wondering, is it an opinion if I don't write the questions down? I don't know. What do you think?
It's kind of a tricky one, because you might summarize walking out and saying the teacher asked higher order thinking questions, but again, that's kind of an opinion, because unless you have evidence of actual higher order thinking questions, how can you be sure? You're in the classroom for 15 minutes this year, and within that 15 minutes, we want to gather not every single higher order thinking questions, we want to gather enough samples that let us know what is the pattern of practice. So when we look at the pattern of practice, we're really trying to establish it's more often than not that the Lookfor evidence tells us what. It's more often than not that the teachers are asking a range of developmentally appropriate questions that elicit higher levels of thinking. And we want to look first at the teacher. We're then going to take that out to the team, to the school, and to the district in order to make those data-driven decisions. So again, it's a pattern of practice about the evidence and about the Lookfor. It's not about the individual teacher.
Great clarification, Dawn.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to practice, and we have 4 videos that we want to go through essentially the Lookfor process, because we will be going into 4 classrooms this year. Isn't that right, Ilea?
That's right, Dawn.
All right, so we got 5 teams going into 4 classrooms, so that's going to be 20 evidence points that we're going to gather evidence on. So for this particular example, we want to focus on Lookfor 3, and that is about the levels of thinking. How deeply does someone interact with the text or material in order to complete the task or answer the question? So to review, a level 1 on task and questions is there is no evidence. You can't see any of it. And remember, that can either be what's being said or what you see in the lesson plans or what you see on the student work. A 3 would be there are a few tasks eliciting higher levels of thinking, but the majority of tasks are at lower levels of thinking. And a 5 would be there's evidence of a range. And I want to key in on that word. There's a range of tasks eliciting higher levels of thinking. So the questions, again, a 1 is no evidence of questions that elicit higher levels of thinking. A 3 would be the teacher asked few developmentally appropriate questions eliciting higher levels of thinking. And a 5 being fully implemented and embedded. And let's talk about the second thing there. Student and teacher generated higher levels of questions are present. So that's going to be crucial that when we go into the classrooms, we're looking not just to the teacher and recording their evidence, but also the students as well.
So Dawn, let's go ahead and start looking at an elementary example of a video.
Okay, let's do it.
All right.
So Ilea, hold on, let's tell them something though.
Okay, so before we get started, the video is not as good as being there. And you know that we're gathering evidence for what we see and what we hear. As you watch the video, we're going to focus on Lookfor 3, levels of thinking, tasks, and questions. I want you, each of you that are participating now, I invite you to record examples of what you hear and what you see the teacher and students saying and doing specifically around tasks and questions. Once the video plays, take a minute with your group to discuss the type of evidence you just gathered around tasks and questions to reflect individually.
This is going to be only 1 minute. So for 1 minute, we want you to write down what do you see and what do you hear.
Everybody ready?
Here we go.
Yes. Oh, yeah. What did we discuss yesterday? Oh, look at these brains working. Henry. We discussed what happened and why did it happen. Right. We learned that there's usually a reason for what happened, right? Yesterday I went, what? Almost, yeah, you're right. Yesterday I went for a run. I got back. I had some water. Why do you think I had some water? I didn't tell you. Why do you think I had some water? What's the reason? Because you were thirsty. Yeah, because I was thirsty, right? Okay, so we read the book. If you give a pig a pancake, and this pig, a lot of things happen, right? We only wrote down a few. She was sticky because she had syrup. She had to take a bath because she was sicky. She wants to visit her family because she was homesick. And she gets sticky again. Who remembers why she was sticky again? Because she saw 3 cows. And how did she get sticky? Pigs too like getting messy. And because the wallpaper had the glue, right? To put it up onto the treehouse. Okay. Yes. Did you have to put wallpaper on your house? I didn't put wallpaper on my house. No, I just painted. But thanks for asking.
So what we invite you to do is to take a minute for discussion and reflection. Discuss the evidence each of you gathered around tasks and questions only. So let's talk about some of the evidence that you gathered with your team. So here's what Dawn and I came up with. So here are some of the things that we heard the teacher say. What did we discuss yesterday? Yesterday I went for a run, then I had some water. What? Why do you think I had some water? As you can tell, it was a lot of directed conversation from the teacher to the students. Student responses, like Henry's, we discussed what happened and why it happened. Because you were thirsty. You'll notice that it says Coral for students. We listed how many times Coral student responses were allotted. Notice also Dawn wrote down what those Coral responses were. And then, of course, the one student-generated question during this lesson was, did you put wallpaper on your house? Which happens in an elementary classroom quite often, doesn't it?
Quite often.
So what we invite you to do now is to take another moment for discussion and reflection. Using the Lookfor calibration language, how would you rate this Lookfor using the evidence?
Evidence only.
Take a minute to come to consensus and pause this video. All right, so you've had an opportunity to have conversation with your PLC or your leadership team. So let's take a look at how Dawn and I came to consensus. So with this video, the minute represents the pattern of practice, because in a real classroom, we'll be walking for 15 minutes total. That's not realistic to do in a video, so we've taken that down to a minute. It's a section of time, but we're assuming that is a pattern of practice. So in the 15 minutes that you're walking, it's completely based on evidence with no assumptions.
That's right.
So what I'd like for you to do is compare what you said to what we said. So Dawn and I listed tasks and questions as a 2. And when we look back at what that scale looks like, we really didn't think the task was quite a 3. A 3 is few tasks elicit higher levels of thinking, but the majority are at lower level. The task they had today was having a conversation about the book. And in the time that we were in there, we didn't see multiple tasks, nor did we see a lot of higher level thinking questions. In fact, if we went back to our evidence, I don't believe she asked any higher level questions. And certainly it wasn't an opportunity for students to generate those either. So for tasks, we did a 2. Now when we go back and look at questions, when you look at both student-generated as well as teacher-generated questions, they were very much low-level recall. So when we go back to the rubric language, for it to be a 3, teachers asked few developmentally appropriate questions eliciting higher levels of thinking. There wasn't that much more than recall. Some of you may be thinking, well, that was a kindergarten or a first grade class, so those questions are developmentally appropriate. I would agree to you to a point that kids that are 5 and 6 years old absolutely can be asked higher level questions. You could have asked how, we could have made connections. How can you make connections to what happened with this in your real life, etc. So there's definitely that missed opportunity there. So it's not quite a 3, so we rated that a 2.
And one thing we might disagree when we go out into the hallway. We might say,
Absolutely.
you know what, I don't know, I didn't hear any evidence of questioning to elicit higher levels of thinking. It's about, it's about the consensus that we have. And one of the things that we've come to understand is that even if we disagree, it's about the conversation that we have around the topic, that we talk about what was the questions, we have the conversation, and we come to consensus. There might be somebody with a lot more experience who will come in and might disagree with us. And you know what? That's okay. It's most important that we walk into the classroom, we gather evidence, and we look at that evidence in relation to the rubric and have a conversation about it.
So Dawn, I would also say that it will probably happen that we have a very passionate individual, and it might be hard to come to consensus. Ultimately, the table group leader, that district instructional specialist or director, or it could be Gina Bergens, the assistant superintendent, Sandra Davis, it doesn't matter. Whoever's leading that conversation, they're going to be the ones that will ultimately decide consensus and then keep us moving on, because we do have a time frame.
We do have a time frame. We're going to have to be really precise in our language so that we make sure that while we're in the hallway and we're having that conversation, we could probably take 30 to 45 minutes, but that is just not realistic. We're going to have very few minutes to come to consensus, and consensus doesn't mean that everyone agrees. Consensus means that the majority of us within the group believe and can support the rating.
All right, so let's take a look at another example.
Okay, let's do it.
So as we walk into this next classroom, the video is not as good as being there, and we understand that. However, we can use this practice to gather evidence that is seen and that is heard. So let's set up this walk. When we walk into the classroom, we realize when looking at the lesson plan that the teacher's lesson is continuing after a shared reading on culture. As you watch this video, we are again focusing on Lookfor 3, levels of thinking and tasks and questions. I want you to record examples of what you hear and what you see the teacher and students saying and doing, specifically around tasks and questions. Once the video plays, we'll have a stop and debrief time and an opportunity for you to pause this video and have conversation with your group.
They lived, and then you got to match the artifacts that went with that. Why would you think we would study this? What would be important about that? What would you think you would learn from doing what we're doing?
Well, I think it would be important to learn that because when we're older and we might want to be a teacher or something, like a history teacher,
Okay,
that would be useful information.
good. Another idea, John?
Or maybe to learn about other cultures.
Other cultures, and that culture was a big word at the beginning of this chapter. Do you remember that?
Yes.
The way that people live, culture. Can you tell me some other reasons? That was good. Thank you, both of you.
Like if you're really into history and stuff.
It's interesting,
Yeah,
right?
and
It's
like
interesting.
if you go to high school and you really want to learn.
Exactly.
So you can learn about the past.
Why do you think you might want to learn about the past?
Like if you want to know about your past or your ancestors.
Welcome back.
Hello.
Hello. So let's take a moment to discuss the evidence each of you gathered around tasks and questions only. So we encourage you to pause this video and come back when you've done that. Welcome back.
Hello.
So let's take a moment and let's look at some evidence that Dawn and I came up with. So in this example, you'll notice that the teacher and the students are well balanced in terms of teacher questioning and student responses. When we look at the task for this particular minute, the task was centered around the discussion the teacher and the students were having together. So let's take a look at some of the things that we wrote down as evidence. Why would you think we would study this? What would be important about that? What would you think you would learn about doing what you're doing? She related it back to the text or the culture material that they were reading. Do you remember that? The way that people live is culture? Tell me some other reasons. Student responses were, well, I think it would be important to learn that because when I am older and might want to be a history or a teacher, or maybe to learn about other cultures, like if you're really into history and stuff. So you can notice that some of the questions were very pointed for them to make those connections to the outside world. So what we'd like you to do now is to again pause the video, taking a moment to utilize the Lookfor 3 calibration language. How would you rate this? Look for evidence. Focus on the evidence. Take a minute to come to consensus. Welcome back. So when we look at this particular example, Dawn and I, and the minute represents the pattern of practice in the classroom for the next 14 minutes, then what rating would tasks and questions receive? So we assume this is a pattern of practice. Dawn and I had a lot of conversation about this one.
We sure did.
And we related the task to a level 3 on the Lookfor rubric. So let's go back to that rubric and look at why. So in the rubric, few tasks elicit higher levels of thinking, but the majority of tasks are at a lower level of thinking. The conversation that we had was really centered around the types of questions. She was asking a lot of great questions, but
Now hold on, Ilea. You just used an opinion word. Great question.
I sure did, Dawn.
You did.
Thank you for catching me.
Yes.
So how could I rephrase that?
So I would go back to the evidence. What kinds of evidence would lead you to believe that she was asking higher level questions?
So I would go back to my evidence that I wrote on my paper. So let's try that again. So why would you think we would study this? What would you think you would learn about doing what you're doing? Why do you think you might want to learn about the past? Those why questions are higher levels of thinking, definitely more than recall, to really get our kids' minds on and what they're doing.
That's right. And so I would now take that and I would look back at the rubric and say, okay, I have evidence of higher level thinking questions. So, but what about if we look at the task? Few tasks elicit higher levels of thinking. Because you remember, Ilea, we had a question about, well, what is the task?
Well, the task is the discussion.
The task is the discussion, but is there a task going on? Is it a or few?
I would think that it's A.
It's a task.
In the minute that we were in
In the
there.
minute that we were in there. But if that's the pattern of practice, so we would say a task. So it's eliciting higher levels of thinking, though. There was some higher level questions.
Absolutely.
We have examples of those that we just looked at our evidence. But the majority of tasks are at a lower level of thinking.
So for this one, Don and I came to the consensus that it was a 3 on the Lookfor
Mhm.
language calibration.
Mhm.
For questions, again, we looked at the type of questions being asked. What kept this example for being a 5 was the student-generated questions. Had we seen students generating those questions, because when we go back to that Lookfor language again, student and teacher-generated higher level questions. If that student piece isn't there, it can't be a 5.
It can't be a 5.
So let's take a look at another example.
All right, this is going to be more of a middle school example that we're going to be using. And again, it is 1 minute in length. Now, it's not as good as being there. We can't say that enough because it's really limiting, but we're going to use this as practice for the types of questions and tasks again. So we're looking for levels of thinking, task, and questions.
Dawn, I have a question.
Okay, sure.
So in this example, because I know our instruction specialist for math, Sil Rao, would definitely want us to preface this.
Yes.
This video is not a great example of a highly effective math lesson, especially if you were to rate it for the instructional framework for mathematics.
That's right.
So we're not encouraging to teach division the way this gentleman chose to teach division, right?
That's exactly right, because that would be a different Lookfor.
Absolutely.
Because in this particular case, we would be looking at the math content framework Lookfor, but we're not looking at that one in this particular one. We're also not looking at engagement in this one. We're not judging or rating the Lookfor evidence for engagement. We're looking for task and questions only.
Lookfor 3.
Days ago we did rounding decimals, right? Yesterday we did dividing decimals. Today we're going to take that a step further. But before we can do that, I want to show you guys a couple of these do nows, all right? First one, read it to me, Craig, just how it's on that paper.
6.4 divided by 16.
Okay. Now, like I said a couple days ago, there's a lot of different ways to show division, okay? So here's the first way, is this division symbol. I always wanted to set it up, I want you guys to set up like a house. Remember what we said? In this case, whatever they say first, that's the part that goes where? In the house, exactly. The 16 is gonna go outside the house. All right, so now you work, right? Here's your work. Remember, here's your outside. Is there any work to be done here? So where does this decimal go? Straight up. All right? How many times does 16 go into 6? Can't do it. Now here's the problem, 16 into 64. A lot of us can't do this in our head. There's a strategy that you need to use in order to get 16 into 64. 3 words. Jake.
When you have the divisor, you take that and you guess a number, then you multiply it, and then you see what number you get.
Exactly. You want to see if it's going to go to 64. So let's say we did 16. Let's say we guessed 3, right? Okay. So let's say we guessed 3. 3 times 6 is 18. 3 times 1 is 3 plus 1 is 4. 48. Do we need to go up or down? Need to go up. If you did this correctly, you should have gotten how many times? 4, exactly. 4 times 16 is 64. Now, a lot of you guys are stopping here. What are we forgetting about? The 0, exactly. And 16 is the 0? 0 times. Okay, so your answer should have been 40 hundredths or 0.40. Okay, number 2 is pretty simple. I'm not going to go.
So now what we'd like for you to do is we want you to again pause and as a group talk about the evidence you gathered around task and questions only for this particular classroom. So if we continue on now that we've just paused and we've discussed our evidence, this is the type of evidence that Ilea and I gathered. So notice for the teacher, we have a lot of questions that we could gather here. Is there any work to be done here? So where does this decimal go? On the student side, you'll notice there are actually a couple different ways. You can not only write down what we heard a student say, and Jake in this instance, but we can also note the choral responses that we heard from the students, and we could indicate those with slash marks. We could also notice how many students were responding to the student when the teacher asked a question. So 4 were raising their hand and 1 was not. So these are different ways that we can gather evidence in order to rate the Lookfor. So now what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to pause again, and this time think about how you would rate the Lookfor evidence. Remember, we're not rating the teacher. We're rating the evidence that we just collected based on task and questions. So now that you just paused for that particular moment in time, we're going to talk about how we would rate this. So when we take this minute, and if we assume, and I know, and when we go into the classrooms, we're not supposed to assume, but here if we say this represents a pattern of practice for the entire 15 minutes, then the rating that Ilea and I decided that this task and question would receive, it would be a 2 in both of them. All right, Ilea, does that sound good to you?
It does. So can we talk about what made it a 2?
Well, if we look back at the 2, I always start at the center, and I always would say, and as a group, we might start and say, okay, well, let's look at our evidence. What was the task that the teacher was doing? And they were really having, well, we have a lot of these that have a discussion in them, and it was a whole group discussion. And if the next part of it is about eliciting higher levels of thinking, well, a few of the tasks elicited higher levels of thinking, but the majority of tasks were at the lower levels of thinking. I go back to the task and the higher levels.
And who was doing the majority of the conversation?
Well, wouldn't that be down in questions?
Sure it would.
So with the task, though, if I think about the task, I'd want to go down to the 1. No evidence of higher levels of thinking. Oh, I wouldn't really
2.
go a 1. Definitely a 2. So I agree with you, Ilea. I definitely think a 2. So for levels of thinking questions, the teacher asked few developmentally appropriate questions, eliciting higher levels of thinking. Well, I'm not sure I can give it a 3. So let me look at a 1. No evidence of questioning. Well, there was a little evidence, but there wasn't enough for me to feel like it was implemented higher order questioning.
We couldn't establish a pattern of practice.
Couldn't establish a pattern of a 3. So I would definitely go with a 2. So we're going to do another one, because really this is a great example of we're going into 4 classrooms in order to establish that pattern of practice for our team, in order to establish a pattern of practice for the school. In this particular instance, Ilea and I had to get a little creative about our video
and I'm not Rob Tyndall with editing, so I apologize.
So what you're going to find in this particular video is that occasionally the teacher jumps in, because where we borrowed the video from, the teacher often gives an interview about it. Ignore that and just focus in on the evidence that we see within the classroom, again, related to task and questions.
Read the chapters in Iqbal, and we started to look at questions that we could ask to have a deeper understanding of the text. We start with comprehension, present these questions in order to allow discussion to flow, as well as get a deeper understanding of the issues presented in the text. One of them, open up the floor. Anyone want to start? Gabriella?
According to Fatima, the liquid drips out and it hurts for a while, but in time the skin grows back tougher, so you don't feel anything anymore. How is this statement a metaphor of the children's lives?
It's like they have to get tougher over time, and you just have to learn that it hurts for a little while, but you just have to keep on working.
Marley?
All these kids think that they're eventually gonna escape, that they'll end up getting all of those lines wiped off their slate, and in the meantime they might as well just get tougher, so that when they do end up leaving, that they can be stronger.
Eva reacted to the knowledge that her debt will never be canceled.
I'd be terrified that my debt would never be erased. So when I found out that it never would, I would just literally be scarred.
Another standard.
It says in the book every day. I saw a line mark, but they would never go away. Like my debt can't be like the weeds that grow back in my father's garden. Like when someone confirmed it, when someone from the outside who like seemed so wise and knew so much confirmed that, yeah, your debt's never gonna be raised. That kind of was just a huge realization for her.
Today,
There we are. We're back again. So let's take a moment, one last time. As a team, take a minute to discuss just the evidence you gathered around task and questions only. Now that you've taken that moment, let's go ahead and move on to the types of evidence that we might gather. Ilea and I just realized that we picked all discussion opportunities, but they all looked different, and we were able to gather different types of evidence. So now we're going to finish this classroom off by looking at what the teacher evidence was. So we have it listed here to the left, and then to the right we have our students. Now when these kind of instances, you might not be able to gather every single word that every person states,
And that's okay.
and that's okay. But the most important part you'll notice in the evidence is where it says Gabriella, we capture her question that she generated. At the very beginning of the video, you might not have caught it because it was really fast. You can see on the student's desk that they have notebook paper where they have edited and rewritten and scribbled and scratched. So you can see that these are student generated questions. And then we have evidence that really kind of talks about the conversation that's going on, the discussion going on between students in the room. So if now we took this evidence and we said, all right, let's think about what would we rate this evidence? What would we rate this Lookfor for task and questions? So pause now and take that moment to discuss. And now that you've discussed it, I know we're corny, aren't we? We're so having so much fun with this. So if we took this minute and we said, okay, if this minute represents a pattern of practice for the next 15 minutes in this classroom, Ilea and I came to consensus that we would rate the task a 4 and the questions a 5. Now the questions, let's start with the most obvious. Those were student-generated questions.
Absolutely.
They came up with those. The teacher, though, has established, you know that there was been scaffolding going on because you could look in the lesson plan to find that. Well, we wouldn't know it till we could confirm that. We will look in the lesson plans. We can really even interview the students at some point if there was a pause in the conversation to find out how these questionings go. But we definitely have evidence that those were questions from the student. So for the 4, though, for task, if we go back to the rubric, for the task, an evidence of a range of tasks eliciting higher levels of thinking. We can't confirm a range of tasks unless we saw the lesson plan. Now in the lesson plan, we might be able to confirm that there was a range of tasks because we might look in there and see the teacher, like I said earlier, had scaffolded to get to this moment. We know there is both lower, medium, high, more high going on in the classroom, but we can't confirm that. But based on what we can see, I would say it's more than a 3. It's not just a few tasks, it's because there is so much higher level thinking going on in there. The majority of tasks are not at lower levels. The majority of the task is at a higher level. So we would definitely rate the task a 4.
Absolutely. So furthering the conversation, where does the leadership team come in? Hi, Dawn.
Oh, I forgot I was still on video. Bye.
So furthering the conversation, where does the leadership team come in? Well, they come in terms of having that follow-up conversation after +2. When the team is gone, the work isn't finished. So please remember that when +2 is over, your leadership teams, your PLCs, you can utilize these training videos, have conversations in your PLCs about what it looks like, what it sounds like, and in page 29 of the Lookfor of the +2 manual, it even goes into details for leadership teams and administrators. What kind of guiding questions can we go through to really continue the dialogue that started with our +2 meeting? So check out the Bay District School Improvement website, hashtag BDS School Improvement, BDSSI, and then follow us on Twitter at Ilea Michelle and at Dawn Capes1. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you found this meaningful and purposeful. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, we'd love to hear from each of you. Have a great school year.